Hello, everybody. I see that some people are joining slowly but surely. I'll just introduce myself first. My name is Tutku. I am the learning coach of the Pearson Professional Programs. And one of these programs is Harvard University's Leaders of Learning program. Pearson Professional does it in a way that is a blended learning setting. Harvard University's Professor Richard Elmore is the course designer and the instructor of the online part of the Harvard's Leaders of Learning program. And as Pearson Professional, we do the in-class sessions, face-to-face sessions with subject matter experts locally to support the online learning material. And I'm the learning coach of the program. So I support people and coach them throughout the program for them to successfully complete. So Richard, welcome.
My name is Richard Elmore. I am a research professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I've been there since 1990, and I am the lead faculty member of this Harvard X course, Leaders of Learning. And my current work has to do with the design of innovative learning environments of various kinds around the world. So I work in China, Latin America, the US, and various places. I also have a relationship with an architecture firm where we actually try to design physical spaces for new ways of learning. So that's my current interest in my current work.
Perfect, thank you. So I have a couple of questions I would like to ask you. First, what is the importance of upskilling in today's learning environment?
Could you help me understand what upskilling means from your perspective? Increasing the skill level of students or teachers or both?
For both, actually, to prepare them for the future of work, let's say.
Yeah.
Because the work environment is changing globally, so how we can help them to upskill themselves to be ready for the future?
Yeah. Well, I think that, first of all, the best thing to understand about the way knowledge and skill works in the contemporary world is that the skill requirements for any kind of work improve dramatically over time. So we're in a world in which learning something at a very high level now doesn't necessarily equip you for a high level of work in the future. So that makes the problem of learning more complicated, I think, than it's been in the past. Because in the past, you could be assured that if you mastered a certain amount of knowledge and skill, there would be some place for you in the workforce.
Right.
So now the emphasis is going to be more on learning to learn. Mm-hmm. And that means that you have to be in control of your own understanding of what's next in your life and in your career. Yeah. And what that means in terms of the neuroscience is that if you think of the brain as memory is back here, the emotional and affective part is buried down here on the brain stem in the back, and the frontal part of the brain is where something called executive function resides. What's happening is that learning is migrating from memory to executive function, so that the rewards are in the future going to be less on remembering what you learned in the past, although that continues to be important, and much more on learning how to use the judgment in the present and future. Now, traditionally, schools haven't been very good at that. That is, what we've tried to do is to educate people to remember things and give that information back to us in some form or another. What is going to become important in the future is teaching people how to exercise judgment and understand their own dispositions and needs as learners, and actually seek out learning that helps them improve. So that also means that the modes of learning are going to have to expand beyond the boundaries of school out into the world. And they've already started to do that. So the issue is less, are there going to be multiple modes where people can learn things, and more about how do we teach people how to use those modes of learning productively for themselves.
So speaking of neurosciences, and I want to see, how do you think the future of learning will alter with the current developments in AI and neuroscience?
Well, these are two, AI and neuroscience are two related but different things.
Right.
I think that we don't exactly know yet what the full impact of AI is going to be, because there will be certain things that we think are inherently human-based that will eventually become machine-based. And that's really going to change the way learning is defined and valued by society. Because if there are judgment tasks, I'll just give you one example. We're now at a stage where some types of medical diagnosis are more reliably done through artificial intelligence than by human diagnosis. That's just one example among thousands of how we're redefining the relationship between artificial intelligence and human judgment. It doesn't mean that human judgment goes away. It just means that humans are going to have to specialize in other things, because a big piece of the work is going to go over to artificial intelligence. Just the design of that interface is going to be one of the great challenges, I think, in the future, and one of the most exciting parts. The neuroscience thing is really quite exciting, I think, because what we're doing is we're actually now learning a tremendous amount about how human beings learn. And most of that knowledge so far is not accessible to educators. It's being done by neuroscientists who aren't actually particularly interested in schools. They're really interested in human beings and how they learn. So there is in the future a big project that has to bridge what we're learning about neuroscience and how it works. Now, just one example of something that that's going to change the way we think about learning. In the past, we've assumed that young children have a predictable developmental course where they take on different cognitive functions at various ages. And what we're discovering is that whole way of thinking about child development is actually an artifact of the things we use to measure learning. And that when you change the measurement from external measures that psychologists develop to actual brain activity monitors, what you discover is that children are capable of developing what we regard as higher level cognitive functions much, much, much earlier than we assumed, and that they're doing this without our intervention at all. And that part of the problem is that we've constructed educational settings that actually slow down this development process. And that the challenge is going to be more curious about what the capabilities of young children are as learners, and to allow them to grow at the rate at which they're basically biologically programmed to do it. many of the practices that we use to discriminate between talented students and students with less talent are also artifacts of measurement. And this is going to be a major challenge in the future, because as we begin to be able to track how people actually learn things, what we're going to see is that different people develop at different rates.
Right.
And that what we often see as major differences among students learning at different points in time are really just differences in the rate at which students are capable of learning things. So part of the challenge in the future is to be not to discourage people from continuing to engage in learning just because they're on a different developmental course. And these kinds of things can be tremendously costly to society, because when we take people basically and classify them as less talented without understanding this business of how people differ in their rates of development, we actually diminish the ability of those people to contribute their highest and best talent to society overall. So these are going to be some really big challenges to education in the future.
So speaking of different type of learners, how would you describe personal learning theory, and how does it affect one's own learning or teaching abilities? Can we touch that a little bit?
Well, first of all, I think that in general, educators have allowed the state and the culture to dictate theories of learning, and often these theories of learning are very traditional and not very based on actual science and inquiry and deep understanding of learning. So we've always had what I call outlier theories, Montessori, Reggio Emilia, that have challenged the basic assumptions of learning and have actually developed alternative models of learning that demonstrate that children can learn very differently at very different rates and much more ambitiously. But the mainstream has always tended to focus on rather traditional conceptions of learning. The reason I try to make an argument for personal theory of learning is that I think everybody who is in the learning business, and that's not just teachers in schools, that's anybody who wants to influence the learning of children and adults, needs to be engaged in a continuous project of understanding and revising their own understanding of how learning occurs in terms of their own experience and in terms of the science behind learning. And that in the future, professions of learning are going to be defined by how sophisticated we are in doing this. And then I think that having a personal theory of learning means that you are willing to, it's a theory, right? It's that you're willing to subject that set of understandings to some kind of empirical test and to allow yourself to change and develop over time your understanding of learning. My basic prescription for people who want to design new learning environments is try to design an environment in which you expect to be surprised by what children and adults can do. Should always be looking for the next insight or understanding that demonstrates to you where your theory needs development or where your theory might be wrong. I think that the challenge in the future is going to be around, in traditional learning theory, we have allowed ourselves to be influenced by very prescriptive and very rigid developmental understandings of what children can do or should be allowed to do at different ages. And that's not where the neuroscience is going. The neuroscience is going in a far more flexible direction, where people are capable of learning on multiple dimensions at multiple rates over time. And the challenge is going to be how to build on those differences and that variability, and provide multiple opportunities to people for growth. And that's where the big challenges are.
So how does the organizational structure affect individuals' learning capacities?
Well, that's that's a question I spent about 30 some years of my career focused on.
Great.
And I have to say it's a good demonstration of my own personal learning theory, which is I started out believing, because I was a specialist, a researcher in organizational development, organizational design, organizational theory, and I taught it. I had a very strong belief that the structures that we put people in, particularly in schools, have a huge impact on what they learn and how they learn it. And I think that to some degree that's still true. But I think that the big mistake that I made, and that I think a lot of people make, is that changing the structure will change the learning. I think actually the causal arrow runs in the opposite direction, which is the reason we have the organizational structures we have is because we don't have the imagination to think of different modes of learning and to challenge those structures, physical structures and organizational and social structures. And so we don't have to exercise any creativity or imagination, because the physical structure within which the learning occurs gives us a theory of learning, and culture gives us a theory of learning. Now, so what's happened in the last 10 or 15 years for me is that I've started to entertain the idea of, suppose you started with a theory of learning. What kind of structure would you end up with? And if you allowed the theory of learning to dictate the structure, the physical structure, and the culture, the way the culture defines the spaces and the relationships between adults and among students, if you allowed the theory to influence the structure, would you end up with a different solution? And the answer, I think, is yes. That the really powerful learning environments that I'm in right now are people who've had the courage to step out and develop an alternative theory of learning, and then to build a social and physical structure around that. And I think that many of these maker spaces, that is, places where kids go to build and create things, are a demonstration of this. I'm involved in a very interesting social movement in Mexico, in 9,000 schools, where the basic mode of learning is students teaching other students and adults teaching students how to teach each other. And that's dramatically altered the social structure between teachers and students, and it's dramatically democratized access to learning in rural communities in Mexico. So I think that the future is really going to be organized around people who have powerful theories of learning and are willing to develop the social relationships and the physical structures that go with those theories.
Right. Since every individual has their own theory of learning, own learning styles, then how can teachers optimize the content and delivering of education to fit the needs of each individual in a classroom?
Well, uh,
They really do it at the
yeah.
first place.
First of all, you have to have some agreement among adults that children develop at different rates in different domains.
Mm.
That that and that has to be a powerful cultural norm, and that's hard because we're coming out of a tradition in education where students are expected to demonstrate certain types of mastery at certain ages in certain content domains, or they're judged to be not capable learners. So we've got to develop a culture in which adults actually learn to see in themselves and in other people this difference and variety in the way individuals develop. Then I think we have to step out of the testing and assessment traditions that we have developed on the old model and learn to do much closer diagnostic work. It doesn't mean that we abandon making judgments about more and less effective ways of learning, but it means that the model becomes something a little more like the medical model, in which really highly qualified physicians are trained to really understand the individual's, the constellation of social and emotional and individual factors that contribute to what the individual is presenting as a medical problem, and then to tailor the diagnosis and the treatment to that individual. So it means that the interaction among learners is much more personalized. Right. We know how to do that. I think at some level, we choose not to do it because the challenges organizationally are just too formidable. When you have a room full of 40 children, it's extremely difficult to do. Yeah. On the other hand, I've been in schools in Australia where there are 80 kids in one room, and the kids are managing most of the instruction and learning at very high rates. And there are 80 kids and 4 adults. And so I think that, and every single student in that setting has an individualized learning plan, and every single student knows their progress in each content area. So I think that to some degree, we've overestimated the complexity of this in the interest of kind of standardizing the treatment of students. And that there are people who've broken out of this model who we need to study and understand actually how they do it. But I think what causes a lot of adults to be cautious about this is that when you make that transition toward a more individualized approach, it means giving up some control over the student, right, and giving more responsibility to the student. And many adults believe that students are simply not prepared developmentally to take that control. The evidence suggests otherwise.
Okay, very good. So let's talk about leaders of learning a little bit. So why do you think educators should take this course, and what is unique about it, and how they can benefit from it?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that doing this course for me has been one of the 2 or 3 most powerful learning experiences in my entire professional career. I've never had anything quite like this. Wow. So I mean, there are several parts to that, but my original intention was to create a conversation among educators in traditional school leadership and teaching roles on the one hand, and people who are passionate about and interested in learning, but not involved in schools, but interested and passionate about learning in other settings, and to bring that conversation together so that we could imagine a future in which learning is more broadly distributed in society and there are more opportunities for children and adults to develop. So that was my original intention behind it. It turns out that in the early stages, most of the participants were people who work in schools.
Right.
Over time, that's changed a bit. So there are now many, many more people who are not, who are involved in learning organizations of various kinds who are not involved in traditional schools. Right. And there are many people from other professions who are taking the course: architects, lawyers, physicians, scientists have taken the course.
Really, anyone can benefit from it.
Yeah, right. So, so I've had all kinds of interesting conversations with people who come at the course from very different angles. It's been picked up by an organization in France, in Paris, that's run by a very famous biological scientist who is interested in reforming the way learning is treated in the Francophone world, in France and in North Africa and various places. And they've taken it several steps beyond where I've taken it, and are really thinking very broadly about learning. I've had engineers and architects who take the course and who are involved in professional education themselves, but who are also trying to rethink the way engineering could influence the way learning occurs. In Latin America, some young people I've worked with who've come out of universities with non-traditional education backgrounds in engineering and the sciences have started to organize learning environments in the cities to serve poor children. So as the course has gone on, it's become more like what I intended it to be. I think the challenge in the future is going to be how to loosen up the boundary between schools and the rest of society as a learning system. I think schools have been far too parochial in their structure, and that they need to become much more permeable and much more in touch with the environments around them. And that's going to involve some work across boundaries, because there are many people out there in the world now who know a lot about learning. And it's important for educators to make those connections. So that's kind of why I got into the course in the first place. And I think over time, I've seen that it's beginning to actually happen. The enrollments in the course have just been phenomenal. I mean, we're in the high tens of thousands of people. And I find that just astonishing. I think about the number of students I taught at the Harvard Graduate School of Education over 30 years. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the number of people who've taken Leaders of Learning. So it's quite an amazing. So it's
how many years has it been, Richard?
Pardon?
How many years has it been since you developed this course?
I think we're in year 6. Yeah, since we started the development of it. I guess the other thing I have to say is this whole process gave me really deep respect for people who work in media and who work in the digital environment. Because frankly, the course makes me look a lot smarter than I actually am. And it's because of the skill of the people who are the producers and the creators of the content. And I feel like it's taught me something about the relationship between the medium and the message, because I think that they enhance the value of the course a lot over what I would have done had I been in charge of it only by myself.
Right. So I want to remind to the participants, if you have questions, please feel free to drop it on the chat box. We already have one question. We have a couple minutes left. If you're okay with it, I would like to ask this question to you. They ask, do you think the inherent ability of children who are programmed to learn at a higher rate or through an easier way can be reinstated when they become adults?
I think that the evidence suggests, and here you have to take the long view. We need to begin to think about human beings as programmed by evolution and biology to be learners. The reason we are what we are, and the reason we have created what we've created, is that we, as a species, are programmed to learn. So, in terms of just matters of degree, human beings are exponentially more powerful learners than other species. We've evolved to do that. We have not yet developed a degree of understanding of our evolution as learners to appreciate how powerful this capability of learning is. And to some degree, we have set up structures that inhibit the growth of people as learners. And we need to take responsibility for doing that. So when someone says that there are inherent differences among human beings in their abilities to learn, I think that we are now at a period of time where we need to question that. That is, there are conditions that inhibit learning, and some human beings are subjected to those conditions more than others. But I think what the neuroscience is saying is that we haven't yet discovered what the limits are of these so-called inherent abilities to learn. That most of what we characterize as inherent differences among human beings and their abilities to learn have some social construction behind them. And that what we need to do is to relax that preconception and say, what do we know about the capabilities of people as learners, and how do we capitalize on those? I think when you do that, what you discover is when you find that place in the human being where their interest and their practices of survival and their understanding of the world begin to intersect, you've found a very powerful place, and that's what ignites the learning. It may not be in areas or in subject matters or in content domains that we approve of, but most social innovation comes from people who defy those boundaries, basically. When Bill Gates decided, he was bored with Harvard College and just decided that it wasn't what he wanted to do. He wanted to go play with computers. Basically, I'm sure his father was very unhappy with him, right?
Yeah.
But he was following a course which has transformed, for better or for worse, a big piece of the world. I think that we tend to sort of chalk that up to some kind of inherent genius. I think that that's present in virtually every human being in one form or another. It's just that we haven't actually figured out how to capitalize on that. So I'm very optimistic, but I think it also means that we have to learn to really appreciate the fact that human beings are biologically programmed to learn. We have 100,000 years in the bank of evolution and biological programming that we simply cannot afford to waste. And in the future, that needs to be available to us because we're facing some really big challenges.
Right. I think that answered the question pretty well. She says, thank you very much, who asked the question. We have another question here. Do you think that information overload, particularly in some courses in the undergraduate curriculum, compromises students' creativity?
Absolutely. I think there's absolutely no question about that, which is we have what I call the bucket theory of learning, which is we tend to think of rigor as, first of all, as a good thing. And secondly, we tend to think of it as quantity. And it's this information theory of learning, which is you pack your memory with facts, and then you test your recollection of those facts. And that's the measure that we use to decide whether you deserve to be called a good and a smart person. That's actually not the way the brain works. So, but it's the way organizations work, and it's the way the culture works. So we've got some work to do on that. I think that one of the things that impresses me, I have done some observation of the way doctors learn at the Harvard Medical School. And they're very, very careful and very sophisticated about how they educate physicians at Harvard. And they pay very close attention to this issue of overload. And they also pay very close attention to the fact that what neuroscience is telling us, which is that people don't just learn with their brains, they learn with their bodies. So they always try to integrate some kind of practice into the learning that students do at the medical school, so that they're not just assimilating information and being asked to remember it, they're actually using it in interactions. So they've built, for example, a very sophisticated laboratory where they can actually watch medical students interact with patients, in quotes. These are actors that are hired to be patients, and to observe the interaction between the physician and the patient to provide feedback to the people in their practice as physicians. Now that's the kind of learning that sticks, right? That's the kind of learning that people remember, not just in their heads, but in their bodies, right? That becomes a powerful influence over time. So that I think we have real work to do around, especially, well, at the secondary level and at the higher education level. We have real work to do around whether we're actually doing learning, or whether we're just asking people to remember stuff. Right. And that's going to be a tough conversation.
Absolutely. Any other questions? I'm asking the participants. Richard, I think those are the questions so far. Do you have anything to add?
Well, I guess what I would say is I worked for 25 years with schools, and I worked with them at a very, very, very direct and very tight level of interaction. We spent a lot of time in classrooms observing teachers and students doing work, and we developed some protocols for understanding and studying that process and how to change it. And so I still believe that we can do much better than we're currently doing in school. But one of my big wishes is that educators who work in schools would become more familiar with the way learning actually works in the world. And that we provide people more opportunities to step out and to look at people who are highly skilled in areas and domains that school is not very good at. People who are brilliant carpet weavers, pottery makers, people who build things, people who organize things, people who are capable of understanding complex human interactions, and people who understand families and groups. How do they do what they do? Because I think that if we expand our understanding of the role that learning plays in society, schools will become much more powerful players in the field. What I worry about is that in the digital age, the rules have changed dramatically, not necessarily for the better, but they've changed dramatically. So that I'm for example, an artist. I'm a painter, and I study art.
Wow.
About 80% of the study I do is through a portal, a digital portal called the New Masters Academy. There's an advertisement for it. That is actual online art school. And I have many of the affordances of going to art school that are available to people who actually go to art school. And it's much more flexible, so it accommodates my schedule, etc. I think that when we think about the impact of digital culture on learning, we tend to think about the dangers and the quality issues, all of which are quite real. But what we tend to understate is that it's happening, and it's happening big time. So that now in the US, I don't know whether this happens in Turkey, but in the US, when kids who are struggling in mathematics, for example, in the middle grades, are basically not depending on their teachers to teach them algebra. Mm-hmm. There's an online service called Khan Academy.
Yeah, I have used it myself actually.
Right?
Yeah.
So when you talk to parents whose kids are struggling in mathematics about how they're dealing with their homework, they'll tell you straight up that they don't pay attention to the teacher anymore. They go straight to Khan Academy, and there are 4 or 5 different, for every math problem that you're struggling with, there are 4 or 5 different versions that are trying to accommodate to students' different developmental patterns and different ways of understanding mathematics. Well, once that starts to happen, I think educators need to wake up and say, we need to sort of begin to change the way we do things and to step out into the world and figure out what's going on out there that can help and support us, or more importantly, change the way we do our work so that we can play a more powerful role. And for me, that's the meaning of the development of digital culture. I think that it's very real. The other thing is that I just have to tell you, the number of emails I've gotten from people who are in isolated rural communities, mm-hmm. who have no access to university education, who've enrolled in Leaders of Learning, who are interested in doing something in their communities. I mean, it's a pretty impressive list of people, right?
Absolutely.
Well, they're going to do something. And I don't have any control over what it is, but they're actually going to do something.
Something good.
And I think that's another index of the power of digital culture.
Yes, I mean, we got another question while you were speaking, and actually you answered the question, but I'm still going to put it out there. She asked, do the ways of learning change as the technology improves? Does the modern world we live in change how our brains learn? I guess you touched it already, but if you want to add to that.
I think I'm not sure it changes the rate at which we learn. It changes radically, it changes the distribution. And we have yet to understand whether it's actually going to change the rate. But I think what's going on is a radical redistribution of access to knowledge. And we don't know what impact that's going to have. We're running a little experiment now because for the last 5 or 6 years in China, for example, there's been a narrowing and narrowing and narrowing of access to digital information outside of China. And I think that the experiment is, will we notice a difference in the development of science and learning as a consequence of that? And in what ways does it influence that? So I feel like that's one of the experiments that's going on right now. We're also learning, I think, like in the US, we're learning that there's just a lot of dangerous stuff on the media.
Right.
and it's raising all kinds of problems. And in order to preserve what's powerful and valuable about digital culture, we have to actually face those issues too. So those are all issues of how society is trying to influence the flow of learning through various digital portals. Unquestionably, it's going to change the way we learn. And when it starts to change the way we learn, it is actually going to alter the physical structure inside the brain of how we learn. And we don't have any idea yet about what those changes are going to be, whether they're going to be positive and powerful or whether they're going to be limiting. And one of the reasons to be interested in learning is to be vigilant about those issues and to try to influence the direction that they follow. In general, I think it's going to be very difficult to control the rate at which human beings learn, because we are learning machines. We are biological learning machines. And the sooner we recognize that, and the sooner we capitalize on it, the better off we're going to be.
Yes. Richard, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to chat with you. I think we answered all the questions by the participants. Thank you again for joining, spending your time, your morning, early morning there, I guess, right now.
Yes, and it's been a great pleasure for me.
Great. Okay, then. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thanks.
Sure.
Bye-bye.